I welcome you to an introductory series of presentation for the diagnosis and treatment of the adult replacement child condition. I am Kristina Schellinski, teaching analyst and supervisor with the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, as well as a supervisor with the Geneva University Psychiatric Department. I have a clinical practice in Geneva, Switzerland, and there I have met over the last 20-some years with many, many adult replacement children. I have condensed my experience in a book with the title Individuation for Adult Replacement Children, Ways of Coming into Being. I have the honor and pleasure to give this presentation within the framework of the block training program of the Jung Institute in Küsnacht for people who are training to become analysts. And exceptionally, this event is also open for visitors of the Replacement Child Forum website. Welcome to you all. I will give an introduction into this condition, which is an existential condition. A replacement child is a person who is supposed to replace a sibling or other family member who has disappeared. They are born into or face later on the tension of the archetypes of life and death. Many replacement children do not know that this is what they suffer from, and nor may we, therapists or psychoanalysts. Carl Gustav Jung himself was a replacement child, and he searched for the answer to the question, who I am, in the depths of his soul. And that is why I entitled this presentation, What Can Be More Fundamental Than the Realization, This is What I Am.
So the way I've structured that is to give you an introduction to the Jungian theory of working analytically and therapeutically with adult replacement children, how to diagnose this condition with the help of telltale symptoms and symbols, and to point out structural elements which are listed here: the attachment process, bonding, identity formation, unconscious grief and guilt, the shadow and the relation to other, which of course takes us to the concept of Jung of anima and animus. These structural elements of this condition have for me by now a symptomatic value. I can see from these areas whether this is what I might be dealing with. Finally, I want to show you, of course, the transformation that is the individuation process, how I can go from an experience of missing other, missing anima, animus, the image of it, intimately relating to it, towards a union with self.
This is a growth process towards self-realization. Individuation is essentially a dialogue between our unconscious and our conscious. This process is important to all of us to live a full life, but it is especially vital for those persons who came into being and were seen to replace another person. So they have to search for who they are. They have to search for their self. They want to discover, get a glimpse of a feeling of wholeness, of belonging to themselves, of a coming together of me, my conscious self, and my unconscious self, the original being that may have been overlaid by projections and expectations, or even self-identifications.
The individuation process, a painting that you may know by Jung, a never-ending journey, a road without an end, he wrote on the top in German. And I hope to entice you to embark on it, maybe with me in the next few hours until 10 to 1. My objective is also to show you a new Jung and to give pause for reflection if the replacement child condition affects you or someone you know. Every human being must strive to differentiate himself or herself from contents in the unconscious in order to become the unique individual she or he can be. Now, for adult replacement children, this journey can be a lifesaver because it frees them from an unconscious confusion, an amalgam with a dead person, and rendering conscious the long-term effects that can last for a lifetime if one is overshadowed around birth by the archetype of death. So then individuation is opening a door to a reconnection with life, with one's own life. And the process of individuation and the role of the self in the striving after your own being are very central concepts in the Jungian approach. They offer us analysts and therapists a chance to understand these clients, and they offer replacement children a chance to experience a psychological rebirth, a kind of self-birthing, if you wish, a reconnection with true self. What can be more important than to know this is who I am? Actually, Jung wrote, this is what I am, and I will come towards this later on. Because with the what, Jung refers to the universally significant task of entering into this dialogue with our unconscious, to differentiate ourselves from our false or incomplete assumptions as to think who we are. He's basically saying the what is the psyche from which the who, which is you or me, which is the I, the conscious I, can be reborn. Jung searched for the answer to this question, who am I, and found it in the depth of his soul. He researched the human soul, and his goal was the self, is what his own grandson, Andreas Jung, has written in his article, The Grandfather. For Jung, it is the self precipitating this process, the individuation process. So now, why replacement children? And the replacement child condition is a very complex, multi-layered condition affecting many human beings in childhood, but I do not work with children, so I have focused on what will be the consequences when one is an adult. So the pressing question is, who is a replacement child, right? And in the narrow definition, this is a child who is conceived in order to replace a child that died. But the definition has been broadened. So it is a replacement child that is conceived, yes, that may be born after one that died because it was already on its way. It may be a child that is adopted, or in the most general sense, given the role to replace a sibling or maybe even another member of the family. There are many subcategories, if you wish. You might have a replacement child from in vitro fertilization. If you have several eggs fertilized, some are frozen or some are discarded. You may have a replacement child after a child has fallen ill or is physically or mentally challenged. Or you may have, I've recently come across a case where a child was lost, quote unquote, in a divorce process, and a child born to the next remade, reconstituted family was considered a replacement. So it can go from a very, very narrow definition to a much broader, and one has to, of course, be careful that it doesn't get lost, that it is too wide, but I think we will discuss it. We'll see what you think about it. I think there is a wider definition necessary than just the one conceived to replace one who died. Now, what I have to say is not every replacement child, not every child after a loss or in the connection with a loss is a replacement child. That will depend on many factors. Now, you will say that human beings have always been born after a death, that that's part of the human condition. And it is, indeed it is. It is, I think, an existential condition. And I wish to sensitize you to the consequences. Maybe it's a little bit like we were not aware of how deep run the consequences of trauma, theorized way after the first shell shock symptoms of the First World War. It took decades to realize what are the consequences of trauma, or it took several decades to realize what are the consequences of sexual abuse. And I think here is an existential condition which may affect many of us, and I'm working to make it as conscious as possible what may be some of the structural elements so that we can recognize it. It was discovered after the Second World War, when children rescued from the concentration camps who had to replace entire families were studied. And the first Sentinel article was published by Albert and Barbara Kane in 1964. It's a fantastic article, which set me actually onto my research. And I've listed some of the other important core researchers: Poznansky, Etchegoyen, Sabadini, Vardy, Kogan, Perot, a French author, Yehuda, who has, Rachel Yehuda, who has researched the transgenerational transmission across 3 generations of this particular condition. And there are many more authors that you will find on my notes. Now, Carl Gustav Jung, I said, is a replacement child, and I see that in connection with his theory development. He's born after 3 dead children, after a sister stillborn, 1870, after another sister, stillborn, 1872, and after a boy called Paul, like the father of Carl Gustav Jung, born in 1873, but who lived for only 5 days. He was not named after his father. He was not named, thankfully, Paul, but Carl Gustav. But Carl Gustav was his grandfather, a medical doctor and professor in Basel, who had lost 3 wives and 6 children from 3 marriages to illness, most of course to tuberculosis or consumption, as it was referred to at the time. Jung did not mention his dead siblings in his works, and they are apparently not even in the black books. I asked Sonu Shamdasani. According to his grandson, Andreas Jung, he must have known, though, about those missing siblings because they were noted in the family Bible. So there was a lot of loss before his coming into being. And in my view, you can tell from his work. Many passages are expressing an existential insecurity. It seemed to me miraculous that I should not have been prematurely annihilated. Memories, dreams, and reflections. There was an unconscious suicidal urge or a fatal resistance to life in this world. Not after difference, as you think, must you strive, but after your own being. There are countless passages in Jung's work which attest to his search for this core being. This last quote is from the 7 Sermons to the Dead. Now, he also wrote, somewhere deep in the background, I always knew that I was 2 persons. And when I started, and I can see it from that angle still today, the 2 persons refers to this distinction between the two personalities, the universal experience we all have of having a conscious personality we know about, and a by way far larger unconscious personality. So the distinction between conscious and unconscious. But I think we have to take into consideration that Jung was born after 3 dead children into a family with repeated loss and grief experiences, and that at birth he encountered the archetypal energies of death and life long before he could consciously behold them or search for images of them. So it is of little wonder for me that Jung examined in depth these existential questions to a depth that I think no other theoretician has, that he wondered what lay beyond, that he looked for the anima mundi, that he looked for the soul of the world, that he looked for his own soul, as you know, when he cries out in the Red Book, "My soul, where are you?" Is there anything more fundamental than the realization, this is what I am? This is how I look at Jung. And he searched for who he was by exploring the depth, really, the deepest layers of his unconscious. And this question, is there anything more fundamental than the realization, this is what I am, runs for me like a golden thread through his work. It's the I that is born from the self, what he refers to with the what. So the destructive and the creative sides coincide in a replacement child. Actually, the archetypes or the archetypal images of life and death are intertwined, like on this beautiful medieval image. It's the underlying double nature of human existence, but it is experienced not at the usual opposite ends, that you first experience life and then you experience death. Here at birth or shortly around it, you have a conjuncture. You have a death before a life, and you have a death that is linked to a life. So that experience of these archetypal energies can collapse into one and cause this unconscious confusion. It's a fateful link ab initio, from the very beginning. Are these beginning and end experience is joined together unconsciously. An experience of death clashes violently with the developing life force of a young child. And we will see later on that the image of other is initially an image of an absent other, a dead other. And that, of course, can impact the development of the unconscious image of other, of anima, and of animus. As I said, not every child born after a death or in the vicinity of loss is necessarily a replacement child. It depends on the level of projection received or the level of self-identification. And also, as we will see, the consciousness of the grieving process, or how much grieving has been done, or whether it has actually been transferred to the stop grief child. This condition is very often overlooked because it's difficult to address death, obviously. Sometimes they are also referred to as substitute or subsequent children. I put it into the most succinct form. When a human being is expected to replace or to be a revenant, such an individual is not meant to be her or himself, but to be another, actually a dead person. There's a very moving poem by Victor Hugo, Le Revenant, for those of you who speak French, and I have an English rendition in my book. So what other way is there than individuation to actually become yourself when these were the circumstances at the beginning? Individuation, which denotes the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, separate, indivisible whole. That means bringing up contents from the unconscious. That means looking at shadow in a big way. But hope, for me, lies in essence in the emergence of self and the rediscovery of the essence of original being. It lies in a psychological rebirth, which Jung said, you can't photograph it, you can't see it, but it's a metaphysical fact. A little bit to breathe. At the end of this introduction, I want to share with you the names of some famous replacement children. There are quite a few psychoanalysts. Sigmund Freud, about Carl Jung we spoke. Sigmund Freud as well. He lost a brother who was born after him. And he wrote that he had such severe sibling rivalry that he wished him away, and that it was a tragedy. It left him with lifelong remorse that that brother, Julius, actually died. It has had an influence on Freud's life, certainly, also on part of his theory. And I think, but I won't go into it, on the relationship between Freud and Jung. Sabina Spielrein was a kind of special replacement child in the larger sense, because she was already much older when her sister died from typhoid. But she says that her troubles, for which she was interned in the Burg Hölzli, started then. Françoise Dolto, Andre Green, I can add Winnicott, who was supposed to be a girl and not a boy, and there are several others. Amongst artists, many artists are replacement children, maybe because they seek out the creative being in life. Ludwig van Beethoven, Maria Callas, Camille Claudel, Salvador Dali, Van Gogh, Goethe, Hesse, Kierkegaard, Munch, O'Neill, Elvis Presley, Rilke, Sellers, Shakespeare, and quite a few others, Lady Diana, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and Louise Gluck, the winner of this year's Nobel Prize in Literature.
And then there are people like you and me. The French psychoanalyst and researcher Maurice Perot found that there are 3 ways out of the dilemma of the replacement child condition: to go crazy, to become creative, probably to counter the initially destructive beginnings, or to become a psychologist. Now, I am a replacement child myself. I was born 6 months after my baby brother died at the age of 2 from an undiagnosed appendicitis. I believe, and that is what I want to present to you, that there is a 4th way out, which is the individuation process, which is the chance to discover, to uncover the original, the inalienable self that is there from the beginning, but maybe covered up by projections or self-identifications. And that is a process we can engage in when we look what is going on in our unconscious, when we recognize some of the images in our dreams, or when we see how it has borne out in our life, in the process of life, what has happened to us. That is in relation with the replacement child condition. And then we can actually embark on a process of self-birthing, of this psychological rebirth. Because in essence, the original being is there, waiting to be rediscovered. Next, I will take you into how to diagnose this condition, and from the diagnosis, how to proceed with the treatment. I welcome you to part 2.